So good day everyone. So today we will tackle about the types of persuasive speeches. So there are three kinds of persuasive speeches most often used in the area of beliefs and attitudes. So these are the speeches of fact, value, and policy. So you can argue about what is, what should be, or how it should be. So in making any of these kind of speeches, you make specific claims that you seek to prove to your audience. So you make these claims by proposition you set forth. Propositions serve as a thesis statement for your speech. You prove your case with facts, logic, appeals to emotion, and your credibility. So our first topic is persuasive speeches on questions of fact or proposition of fact. So our learning objectives is to explain on how to present evidence to prove that the fact is true. So question of fact are one focus of persuasive speaking. So in a persuasive speech, the speaker answers a question by proposing an answer and attempting to convince the audience that the answer is true and that they can believe the speaker. So in essence, the speaker wants the audience to accept his or her view as a cold hard fact. So when we say proposition of fact, a proposition of fact is one that claims something is true or false. So, for example, America has 50 states. So, each statement is a proposition that can be proven true or false by checking with authorities, a map, a textbook, and your experience. So, some of propositions are quantifiable, like the number of states in the United States. Others are simply true or false, like the correct composition of water. So, there are three basic types of question of fact. First is the historical controversy. So, historical controversy, it is the knowledge that an event did happen in the past or that an object actually did exist. So, the question of fact, types of question of fact, the second is question of current existence. So, knowledge that something is happening now in the present. So, I think this is an example of global warming. And the third is prediction. So, forecasting what will happen in the future. So, based on past events, the speaker identifies a pattern and attempts to convince the audience that the event will happen again. So, for example, if someone observes that gasoline prices drop right before national elections, so he or she could attempt to convince others that they will drop again before the next election. So, these are the three basic types of questions of fact. So the proposition of fact that will be subject most persuasive speeches are less straightforward. So I think they might include um, uh, violence on television causes child violence. So each of these propositions can be supported by conducting research in books on the internet or in your college financial statements. So, as you establish the truth of your proposition, you are impacting the beliefs of the audience. So, when creating a persuasive speech based around question of fact, consider the following. First is the thesis. So, when developing persuasive speech, begin with a thesis that states that something is true, meaning that it happened or did not happen, exists or does not exist. So, second is organization and evidence. So, in general, the evidence should be presented in topical order. It is important to consider the evidence carefully. So, the speaker must ask if it is possible that the observations actually occurred or could have been occurred. Are the source of the evidence reliable? And were they in a position to actually observe what they reported? Is there reason to believe that the source may be biased, either personally or by taking prevalent at a time in history. So the third one is reasoning. So the speaker will usually be dealing with inductive reasoning, so in which he or she asks if the audience to agree with a conclusion after presenting all of the evidence. So the speaker proves the position by presenting compelling evidence to support the thesis. And lastly, the ethics. So as a speaker, you have an ethical responsibility to provide reliable, valid evidence to the audience and be aware of and avoid your own bias in the selection of the evidence which you used. So our next topic is persuasive speech on questions of value. So our learning objectives is define a persuasive speech of value. So a proposition of value is one that asserts a speaker's sense of values or a writer's sense of right and wrong. So it discusses good and bad, just and unjust, the beautiful and ugly. So value claims make judgments, and readers need to evaluate the evidence and assumptions supporting such claims. So value claims try to prove that some idea, action, or condition is good or bad, right or wrong, worthwhile or worthless. So this may include arguments about a moral, aesthetic, or philosophical topic. So some propositions of value include, so for example, capital punishments in cruel and unjust. The pursuit of happiness is a worthy life ambition. America's national parks enrich the nation. So each of these propositions can be supported by conducting research, but you will want to go further and involve the emotion of the audience. So, in a speech about capital punishment, you will probably find data about the execution of people later found to be innocent due to DNA evidence. But you also may want to argue the unfairness of the way people are put to death or present the arguments made by the American Civil Liberties Union with respect to the unfairness of the justice system. They argued that in many areas, almost 10 African Americans are executed for each Caucasian. As you establish the truth of your propositions, you impact both the attitude and the beliefs of the audience. So, a proposition of value suggests certain value are important, and the adoption of the proposition would achieve those desired values. So, proposition of values are shown to be desirable or undesirable. For example, with respect of the Patriot Act, one can argue that privacy ought to be valued above security, or one can argue that security should be valued over privacy. So in these statements, the two values are privacy and security. So reasonable people could argue that one value ought to be considered more important than another value. So on the other hand, one could argue that security should be valued over privacy. So, persuasive speeches in question of value imply certain actions, but they are not a call to action. So, this is the questions to ask yourself. When analyzing any type of persuasive speech, you should ask yourself this following question. So, what is a speaker's goal? What are the main points? So, how does the structure of the speech help the speaker to make the argument? How does the speaker try to make you care? How does the speaker use evidence? And what kind of sources that the speaker use? So, when you're creating a persuasive of speech on question of values, so how should you go about creating such a speech? So, first is introduce appeals, information, and criteria. Second, provide evidence that makes your audience arrive at your conclusion. So your claim should agree with the current beliefs and feeling of your evidence. And then use facts to justify your claims. And lastly, Consider your audience feelings and values. So, persuasive speeches of value depend on a judgment that something is right or wrong. So, the speech should include an appeal, criteria for judgment, and facts that supports the appeal using judgment criteria. So, that's all. So, our last topic is questions of policy or proposition of policy. So our learning objectives is to demonstrate how to structure a persuasive speech on a question of policy. So one focus of persuasive speaking is questions of policy, which advocates a change from the status quo or the way things are today. So there is a should, or at least an implied should, in this thesis statement. So the speaker wants the plan proposed by the speech to become policy. Questions of policy contrast with question of fact, which state that something is, exists, or does not exist, and question of value, which state that something is good, bad, beautiful, or perhaps worthwhile. So, proposition of policy is one that includes a statement calling for an action. So, the action is examined to determine whether such an action would be desirable or undesirable. For example, proposing that students should spend more time on homework is a proposition of policy calling for a specific action. While the proposition is based on some value premise, the focus of the discussion is not necessarily on this underlying premise but more on the desirability and ability to act. So it is important to note that policies do not lead to values. Values lead to policy. So the following sections describe some different ways to organize persuasive speeches around questions of policy. So, the following sections describe some different ways to organize persuasive speeches around question of policy. So, problem solution with cause. So, a common variation on the problem solution organization includes consideration of the causes. So, discussing the causes of the problem direct attention to specific points that a solution must address. So, the basic points of this organization are: first is the problem. So, describe the nature and extent of the problem. Specifically, describe that the problem exists and how important or the big problem is. So, second is the causes. So, consider the direct relationship between the problem and its causes. So, think about the problem as an effect and consider the causes that produce the effect. So, show a direct relationship between the problem and causes, not just a correlation where one thing occurred before, after, or at the same time as another. So the third is the solution. So use the causes as criteria to evaluate the solutions. If the speech says that a problem was caused by X, Y, and Z, then the solution or new policy needs to address X, Y, and Z in order to solve the problem. So another is comparative advantage of solutions. So when the audience is already aware of and accepts that there is a problem, the speech can focus primarily on comparing the advantages of one solution over another. So summarize the problem briefly. Do not focus on convincing the audience to believe that there is a problem that needs to be solved. Next is comparative different solution. Discuss different solutions and find the one that solved the most aspects of the problem. Compare one solution with another to select and propose the best to the audience. And last is final appeal. Ask the audience to accept and implement that solution as the policy. So another is Morrow's motivated sequence. So another powerful method of structuring a persuasive message is by using a motivated sequence. So, the organizational plan developed by Alan Monroe focuses on developing a psychological need and the audience and then illustrating how to satisfy that need by supporting the plan or policy advocate in the speech. First is attention. So get the audience attention using a detailed story, shocking example, dramatic statistic, or quotation. Second is need. Show how the topic applies to the psychological need of the audience members. The premise is that action is motivated by audience needs. Go beyond establishing that there is a significant problem. Show that the need will not go away by itself. Convince the audience members that they each have a personal need to take action. Next is satisfaction. Solve the issue. Provide specific and viable solution that the government or community can implement. And then is visualization. So tell the audience what will happen if the solution is or is not implemented. Be visual and detailed. Paint a picture for the audience of what they will experience and what the world will look like when the need is satisfied through the speech plan. And lastly is action. Tell the audience members what specific action they can take to solve the problem and change existing policy. So the advantage on Monroe's motivated sequence is that it emphasizes the what the audience can do. Too often, the audience feels like a situation is hopeless. So, Monroe's motivated sequence emphasizes the actions the audience can take. So, the key points here is there are four basic organizational patterns or three basic organizational patterns for question of policy. First is a problem solution with cause. Next is comparative advantage of solution, and then last is the Monroe's motivated sequence. So the problem solution with causes considers the nature and extent of the problem and direct relationship between the problem and its causes and uses the causes as a criteria to evaluate potential solutions. While the comparative advantage of solutions summarizes the problem briefly, compare different solutions to find one that solves the most aspect of the problem, and ask the audience to accept and implement the most advantageous solution. And then, the Monroe's motivated sequence is attention, need, satisfaction, visualization, and action. So that's all for my report, and thank you for listening.